My name is Penny Mills. I'm the Director of Consultancy at the Audience Agency. I'm a 50-ish woman with brownie glasses, red hair back in a ponytail, flowery shirt. And behind me, I have my signature wooden screen. And over to here is a fan that is facing this way. So I'm living a cave-like existence in an effort to keep cool. So I'll be taking you through the session today, and we will take a break. If I don't, please someone just kind of wave your hand and say we need a break. We're going to go until 3 o'clock, but if you have to leave sooner, then that's fine. We're obviously recording the session, and I can share the slides with everyone after the session. So I will stop every now and again, but to see if there are any particular questions. But please feel free to pop anything in the chat as you think of it along the way if you have any questions. After I've sort of introduced what we're going to go through, you'll see right at the top of the meeting chat, which I can possibly paste again. We'll have a couple of questions for you that you can use Menti for. So if you just on any device you feel like, go to menti.com, and there's a number to put in there. If you can't do that, then please feel free to put any comments in the chat here. So as we say, we are recording the session, just so that you know. You might have seen that popped up. If you do want captions or transcription, then you can press on the show captions CC button. So using the Zoom captions for that. And any other requirements you have, then just please pop them into the chat if there's any problems as you go. If you can sort of stay on mute, and then I'll sort of, there'll be moments when we, you can come off mute and ask some questions. I think that is all the housekeeping. So nice to see everybody introducing themselves on the chat there. So please keep doing that. So I'm just going to share my screen and show you, what we're going to go through today. There we go. So just make sure I get the right button for changing the screen. Here we go. Let's use this one down here. So as the title says, it is a skill set. So one of our sessions where we share, I guess, our own top tips and experience of particular subject areas that are useful when you're working in a cultural setting. So this is a kind of scoot through, I guess, the essentials. So there may be some of you who have delved into evaluation further. So please feel free to share any examples or things on the chat. And I suppose, it would probably take quite a longer session than an hour and a half to go through everything I know. So I would be saved that kind of conversation. But these are the kind of top lines that we think are good to think of. And there's various other kind of avenues that you can follow, and there are resources that we can signpost you to. So in a minute, I'm going to ask you just to share your thoughts on the Menti about why evaluate. So have a think about that. You can just put your a few words in there, and then we can share them on the screen just to see what everyone is saying. I think there's some overall principles. How do you go about it? What headspace do you put on when you're thinking about evaluation? There's a couple of models that one which is very good about, useful for getting everybody involved in the process, and the other one very much about the kind of process of delivering your evaluation and making sure that it's doing what it should be. A little bit about the under the bonnet stuff around evaluation, so metrics and measures and data collection methods, and then we can wrap up with just thinking about, so what about evaluation? So that's, I hope that's in line with what you were hoping to hear today. So if I can just ask you over a couple of minutes, either on the chat or on that Menti, just to pop in your thoughts about why you, I guess a little bit about why you're here today, but mostly about why you would evaluate. And I'm just going to share that Menti screen and we can have a quick look at that. But it'd be great to hear your kind of point of view on why we should be evaluating our work. So I'm just going to share that Menti. So I'm hoping by the time I get to my Menti screen, there'll be a couple of things up there already, if I can find it. Excellent, I love it. So we've got some great things here already to learn from it and implement change. I'm liking that. Secure funding, get public trust. That's a really nice one in terms of either the people you're engaging or what are you doing with my money, or should we do this again? Opportunities to grow and for new projects. See if I can move this down a bit. I will share these afterwards because mistakes are expensive. Interesting. Let's see if we can see the other. Oh, that's not what we meant to see. So, no, I've gone totally in the wrong way. Here we go. This is great. It's nice to see different things going on. I'm just hoping that I can scroll, but I'll have to work that out. I'll share these back, but I think there's some really great things in there. So I think it is all those things that have been mentioned there. Just check that there's nothing in the chat. So thinking about the purpose of the evaluation is really important, and thinking about what you're going to do as a result, and who it is for, are all the things that we're going to bring into the conversation today. So thank you very much for that. And good to see that we're all in the same zone. And I'm aware that, you know, evaluation, we're sort of doing it kind of a lot of the time without necessarily calling it evaluation, because we have to report to funders, we have to apply for funding, we have review moments, we have board reports to do, we're looking at kind of what income. So these are all elements of what evaluation is. And what we'll go through today is how we can bring, I guess, some structure to that, and make sure that it is doing as much as it can within the resources that we have and within the needs that we have. So this is a bit of a definition of evaluation. So as I say, it's structured interpretation, and gives kind of meaning. So why are we doing this? Who's benefiting? What does that mean in a context, in a place, in an environment? And we have this approach, obviously, where we're kind of designing something or developing something with the aim of having particular kind of impacts, but it might obviously also surface things that we didn't expect, so unexpected outcomes or impacts. So it's always related to objectives, and it's either predicted things that we might accomplish or just things that have been accomplished. And I think really important is this how. So as well as the kind of things that you can count and look at and discuss afterwards, All that comes about because of how you do something with a group of people, whatever kinds of people they are. So there are those three elements. There's the who, the how, and the outcomes. And so when we're thinking about the kind of process around it, as people have pointed out, the kind of learning is this kind of formative element to evaluation. So it's kind of an active process during the course of your delivery. Now, if you've got something very short, it's harder to do that, or very quick, or not so big. But when you have something that can give you that chance to kind of learn as you go, so that you're evaluating things and putting those learnings back into how you deliver what you're doing. You can do it kind of in process, and obviously to inform a further iteration or a further kind of stage of what you're delivering. And that formative stuff, that learning, is very much about the how, and therefore you can think about how that kind of plays out when you're passing on some of that learning, potentially, not only for you to do something again, but for others to learn from. And this is very much connected to how a programme is designed. So this process evaluation, so rather than just thinking about the outcomes and outputs, what are you, how have you designed it, who is it delivered for, and what kinds of relationship does the how and the who have to the actual outcomes that you want to have. So you can look at, in play, things that are working, but feel confident to be able to kind of adjust that if it's not achieving what you set out to do. So you can avoid kind of projects going off and not fulfilling the original kind of ambition. And then as we go, and at the end, invariably, you have this sort of summative element, or the kind of outcome evaluation. So here, the summative is often used to report for yourselves, to your funders, to your stakeholders. You're telling the story, and then you can kind of report back to people so that you can bring together all the information. And that invariably is these outcomes. Who did it benefit? How did it benefit? And what has changed, which some of you kind of put up there as well. So we've got this kind of in-play process, and then the kind of summative kind of outcomes elements of evaluation. And I think that, that it's not straightforward always to kind of be able to balance those two things, because you're busy delivering. So thinking about the resource that's allocated to evaluation, and always thinking of this sort of element of proportionality. What is it that you need to do? And do you need to, is it going to be better to kind of focus on particular aspects of what you do, where you haven't got resources to cover everything? So making some of those kind of doing that prioritization through the process of designing your evaluation. One first quick kind of tool, the Centre for Cultural Value, the Audience Agency and Centre for Cultural Value have developed what we called our evaluation principles, that were developed in collaboration with many people in the sector. So some of you may have been involved in that process. And there's lots of detail around them. So this is a very quick summary to really ensure that the evaluation is rooted in what you're doing and the people that you're working with, whether they be artists or community members or audiences or visitors. So that commitment to learning right from the outset, and that you can do that in a formative way through the process of the delivery, as well as pass on things afterwards. Robust, and that doesn't mean you need lots and lots of data. It's getting the right kinds of data, the suitable data, and collecting it in an appropriate way, at an appropriate depth and level and quantity. People-centered is really about working from the perspective of those who are going to benefit from whatever you might be doing, so that you're reflecting their points of view through the process, and that they feel involved in that conversation, in that kind of assessing things as you go along. rather than perhaps imposing a kind of structure or language or measures or metrics onto people that has little meaning to them as they are participating or being part of your project. And then connected. So this is really about ensuring that you connect with the people that you're evaluating with, that it's really clear how you have evaluated, so it's transparent, and that you place it in a wider context. And that might be the population demographics of an area, it might be projects that have gone before, or it might be important to think about how you connect into the different stakeholders and their language and the way that they do things. But it's making sure that through the whole process that it's a shared kind of journey, and not often what we find is people feel that there's some sort of element of kind of judgment about evaluation, or that you have to tell a good story. So this is really making sure that it's a kind of constructive, positive process for everybody involved. Which brings me to the next slide. So one really great tool is the theory of change, where you want to get everybody involved in understanding what the evaluation is about and for, and obviously shaping it as well. And then everyone's really clear why you might be evaluating that part and not that part. They're really clear about the resource that you have available, but most of all, they have a stake in that evaluation that's relevant to them. And
sorry, am I in the way?
Oh, somebody's on. Just pop yourselves on mute. That would be great. Great. So there are some tools which I can give you about the process of having kind of workshops internally about doing a theory of change. The approach is definitely a collective, collaborative process. You may, as a project lead or somebody in charge of a particular area or in charge of evaluation, you know, go through all the aspects of what a project or a program or an organization is about and think, you know, pull out some things. And then the next step is definitely to take those to a group and ask them to discuss them so that you can refine things down. Or you might start with a very open process where you say, okay, what should we, you know, what is this project about? And invariably this should be done, I guess, in tandem with designing the project. We know that often things don't work around that way, and that there's an idea or whatever, so it kind of gets laid on over the top. So again, you just need to check yourself that everything is in, you know, hangs together as a project and the evaluation. So the theory of change is a narrative which goes around the work that you might be doing to, I give it, you know, to articulate the kind of purpose and obviously the change. So it starts off with what is the problem that you want to solve, which sounds a little bit negative, but it could be a big problem, it could be a small problem, it could be a conundrum, it could be something you've observed, and it may be that the project won't go all the way to solving that problem, but that it is addressing, you know, a particular question or a particular thing that is not happening in the world that you would like to see happening, whether that's to do with your own organization or whether it's to do with the people you want to benefit. Then you're thinking, who are the key audience and how are they going to kind of be able to kind of take advantage or get involved or participate or see whatever you're doing? And then what is it that you're going to do? So if you're saying you want to take the world from one place to the other, what are you doing to make that change happen? How are you working? Who are you working with? What kind of project or activity is it? What kinds of activities? What kinds of creative, what kinds of curatorial practice? What kind of approach in terms of participation or co-creation or audience that you're going to do? And then you're saying, okay, so if we do that, what will we be able to see kind of happening? What can we measure? We'll obviously go into some of these aspects a bit further along in delivering that. And then what are the kind of wider benefits that would enable achievement of this longer term change or goal? So this is, and often it's good to kind of work back the way as well. So you can say, okay, if that's our goal, what sort of things should we be doing in order to get ourselves nearer to that goal? And what would we want to see happen? What would we want people to say? What would we want to be able to do? What changes in individuals might happen during the session? And if those changes happen in an audience group or a participation group or an individual or a community, what does that really mean in a bigger sense? Or what might happen over a period of time if we do that? So we'll come up with some examples as we go through. So that's the theory of change model, and it's really it helps you define what you're planning to do. So it's a good kind of project planning process. It is collaborative, and you need everyone to be agreeing and signing up to it. And then as we go into the next kind of model, you'll see how you kind of need to be able to measure things. So you need to be able to be as specific as you can, so that you could say, this did happen, or this did change, or this did shift, or we did this which had never been done before. So you so that you know if you've achieved things and done those kind of steps. I think one crucial element of doing the evaluation and that story of change is thinking about all the stakeholders involved. So it's, again, a kind of collaborative exercise often to think about all those who might directly benefit, whether it's individuals, communities, artists, creatives, curators, heritage owners, the different organisations, and the sort of wider group of strategic bodies if you're working with a local authority or other kind of consortium or partnership group. Then you've got another stakeholder, who is delivering it? Is it people within your organisation? Are you asking other people? Are you inviting the community to deliver things? Who's funding, and what are their thoughts about why you're doing the project and why they are funding it? And anyone else who might have a stake, particularly if you think if you do this, you want to influence someone else who's not involved, so that you could attract funding or do things following a project, for instance. So thinking of what comes after in terms of a legacy. And then almost you kind of have a sort of influencer strategy where those people are kind of starting here, and how positive or keen to get involved with the project might they be, and then what will they, how might you see that they will kind of benefit. So these are all the things that you might think about in terms of the project design, if you've got that set of stakeholders, thinking about what's the best way of delivering a project to bring them benefit, and what will they have to do to bring the benefits. So if you're thinking about engaging people, thinking about their journey to the project, just not only kind of psychologically, as it were, but physically, how will they be able to get involved in the project? How might they think of the benefit? And how are you going to kind of invite people to be part of the project? So these are all things around project design, but they're really important when you're thinking about that theory of change and the narrative that you're wanting to evaluate. And it's a good way of kind of testing back your kind of project and design. So in that vein, I would invite you to go back to the Menti and go to the second question. So I'm going to stop sharing this a minute and make sure that I can bring up the second question. What change do you want to make? I'm just going to make sure that you can do all this. So just take a minute just to think, what kinds of change do you want to make? I'm just wondering whether I've made it so that you can do that. So if you go on to Menti, I'm just trying to make sure that I enabled you to go to that second question. I'm just wondering whether that's working for everybody. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to come back to that because I don't want to. I'll try and fix it when we have a break. Yes, someone's refreshed their URL and it worked. Thank you very much. So keep having a look at that. I think last time I had to set up 2 different Mentis. Okay, I'm going to leave you to do that and then I'll come back to it when we have a break. Apologies for that. But is there anybody who feels that they can shout out or can put something in the chat about what kinds of changes that they're looking to make? Or I'll leave you to do that on the... Okay. We're going to move on. Menti works, thank you. Let me see if I can see it now. Ah, here we go. Right, great. We've got a few. I'm going to share that and then you can keep adding to it. Strategic change, developing audiences, growth and development of audience, feedback, increase sales. Great. I think as we go through, you'll see my thing is often to encourage people to be specific about what it is that you're looking to kind of change in the way that you would when you would write a kind of SMART objective, I guess. So being really breaking it down and thinking from kind of different perspectives. So thinking from what the change might be from an audience perspective or a visitor's perspective, as well as what the change might be from your organizational perspective or practitioners, artists, creatives perspectives, and what particular aspect of your audience makeup you're looking to kind of change. It's often quite useful just to think about things in chunks so that you're not thinking about the whole picture, but you've broken it down and thought, okay, if we're going to do this aspect of work, what can we do to kind of change and evaluate that while you might be thinking of that in a bigger context, so that you feel, that it's easier, more tangible when you're thinking about evaluation. So I'm just going to move on and I'll share those thoughts from you when we share the slides as well. So one, I think as you're thinking, as you're hearing me talk, there are all these kind of connections that, a kind of cause and effect. And so the logic model was kind of encapsulates, so people, academics came together and encapsulated what this kind of, what the chain would look like, so that we can kind of break things down and make sure that what we are designing and therefore what we're evaluating is what's happening, the component parts. So if we go kind of from left to right, there are various things that you bring to a project. So it's people, capacity, money, other kinds of resources that you bring to a project. So you need that, to make sure it happens. Then you're delivering things. So there might be workshops, there might be activities, there might be performances, there might be exhibitions, there might be a campaign. So thinking about what activities you're going to do and who for. And then you're thinking about the outcomes. So what benefits will there be for people? How does that, what is it that your objectives wanted to achieve, and how will that feel for people? And then you've got this kind of longer term kind of impact, so that this is the change. So it's very similar to the theory of change, and you might want to do one or the other depending on whether you're thinking of a sort of broader picture with a theory of change, or whether you've got a very particular project, and the logic model will work really well, where you just kind of break things down. And we'll obviously go through some of these elements. It's often quite good when you're thinking about what you're going to do, just to think from the right, from the end kind of backwards, so that you're saying, okay, if this is what our world looks like in the future, so if we have a greater proportion of our audiences or visitors are from the local area, you're obviously working back, kind of saying, well, what difference will that make? Why, to those people, what difference does it make to us? And how will those people kind of benefit, and what does that look like? So what is it that we have to do or do differently to engage them so that they have those benefits, so that we get this longer term outcome? And what resource will we need in order to be able to do that? The assumptions and external factors are there so that you don't have to evaluate every single thing, really. So if you know that you have some local people already engaging and they get all these benefits, you can kind of use that as your frame, and you can then apply it to increasing that number, or looking at a different part of the local community. You can obviously use existing kind of reports. For instance, there's lots of reports about the benefits of volunteering, so you don't have to put in your evaluation, volunteering is good because you can then just focus on, actually, this volunteer program was to benefit these kinds of people, and we think these are the sorts of things that would be there. And there might be other kinds of assumptions that you need to just kind of put in there. And then the external factors obviously are things that restrain or constrain or enable your kind of project, so that you're not, when you've put your whole evaluation together, people don't kind of go, well, why didn't you do this? Or, what about that? You can kind of say, yes, that's another project. Actually, this was about this, so that you're able to focus in on what you're evaluating, and have a kind of narrative around it in the project. So yeah, so you can go left to right or the other way, and it's good to kind of go up and down the way, so that you can check that it all is a logic chain from one end to the other and back the other way. And this just ensures that you're not doing things that are not clearly going to achieve the outcomes that you would like to kind of predict. Obviously, there is always room for unexpected outcomes, or different ways that people describe the outcomes and benefits for them. So that's our logic model. So those are the two kind of models that you might think about. And as I said, so you might be populating that with all sorts of different things in terms of the outcomes. So if you want to diversify your participants, you might think about how you can create a project with them that develops the kind of benefits that they are looking for. if you don't particularly know that group that well, you may not be able to predict, how to design the project necessarily so that they get the benefits. But if you work with them in one way or another, it might be consultation, it might be actually designing something with people in a co-producing way. So you're connecting the way you do things with the outcome that you want to have. As I said, you might want to have audiences reflecting the local population. So you might look at techniques like partnership with community groups and ways of introducing people to your organisation and the work. You might have increase a sense of community, that you're an organisation that's part of a place and a community, and what can you do to support that community so that you're celebrating, you could celebrate its creativity with free or outdoor events. So you can see this kind of connection between the specifics of what it is you want to do to achieve and what it is and how you might do it. And it's this kind of juxtaposition that you're thinking about in terms of being something evaluative. And right at the bottom is that, if it is about supporting people in career paths in culture, then actually, is there a mentoring program? So it's balance, it's this sort of matching the aim with the delivery, which makes sure that, you don't want the evaluation driving what you're doing, but these are the sorts of things you need to put into the frameworks. I think also there's a lot of debate about the kind of language of evaluation in terms of the actual definitions of words. So outputs, outcomes, impacts, where do you stick in aims and objectives, goals, benefit. So I think when this is one way of looking at it. If people come along with slightly different views, I think it's just making sure that there are all these different elements, and people may call them outputs, impacts, outcomes, but you're looking about immediate things that happen, things that might happen over a period of time. Your kind of goals and the change obviously need to be a kind of bigger contextual kind of thing. And outputs, I generally feel, are the actual activities, how many people engage, who those people are, what did they do, the income that came from it, any specifics that you can kind of count. So numbers of relationships or connections, the number of partnerships that were created, the number of collaborations that were involved in what you're doing, the number of artist grants might have been given out, the number of performances, the number of days an exhibition is open, all those sorts of things. So a lot of this is gathered just through pure kind of documentation. So the really key part of evaluation is just really logging absolutely everything that happened and making sure that you're counting the number of people who come into a room, or where you don't have things like ticketing or other sorts of things. And if it's an outdoor event, thinking about how you estimate the number of audience engagements that there might have been. So just making sure all those kind of numbers are documented as kind of outputs, things that happened and people who did stuff. And then you're kind of thinking a little bit more about what will that change look like? And there are obviously things that you can see and observe and ask about, while people are doing something or shortly afterwards. And obviously the sooner you can do it afterwards. So you're getting their kind of immediate response. It might be that you want to wait a bit and get more kind of reflective responses. So you might have done something participative and you want to come back to people kind of down the line. So there are things that you can, really thinking about what you can ask or count or do kind of immediately. So somebody would say, I've not done this before. So you could say, are you planning on doing it again? Which would be a potential kind of change over time. But you might need to then go back to your audiences and just keep tracking people who came once and then did they come again? So you can ask things in surveys, but that may not be exactly what happens. So you need to be careful about how you answer that and how you deal with that data. I think that using things like the NPS score, which is about recommendation, the Net Promoter Score, and if you're using that consistently, then you can compare, different activities, different exhibitions, different performances that encourage people to recommend a visit to your organisation or engagement with you. So you can use that as something that sort of says, oh, I will recommend this, and you can see to the extent to which people may or may not recommend. But you've got a kind of, that's comparing a score. Whereas if you sort of say to people, will you do this again? And 98% of people say yes. And then you go to your ticketing data and they don't. You just need to be careful about what you're evaluating in the moment immediately and what you can say about what might happen afterwards. So people will say, yes, now I know more about this. And then you might be able to ask them, well, so are you more interested in a kind of broader range of things? So if you go to, I know more about my local heritage. Oh, are you now more interested in heritage generally and might go and seek it out? Again, this is still a might, but it's something casting forward. My confidence has grown because I have done this. I'm now more confident too. And you're obviously asking for the specifics of that. I once asked my daughter about a question that somebody put in. I said, and how confident do you feel? And she said, well, in some things I'm confident, in other things I'm not confident. So what kind of confidence are you asking about? And so I think it's been really clear. Asking teenagers these questions sometimes is quite helpful because they have quite a literal response, which is quite helpful in testing out some of our questions. I met new people and therefore I feel more part of my community. So you can ask both of those things. One has a kind of broader impact than the immediate, I met new people, people who got involved in designing something, and then they kind of think, well, actually, by the end of the thing, you're like, well, maybe there are other things that we could do together. And, the relationship with numbers of people and income. So I think it's really kind of breaking things down so that you're not asking too much in one context, and when you look at those outcomes that you're doing very specific ones so that it really helps you then when you're going to ask people questions, which is what this next section is about. I'm just going to pause a moment just to check the chat. Great. So then there are various ways of kind of getting to those questions that you might ask. If you're thinking in a very logic model way and you're thinking specifically, it should flow that you're then kind of getting to things that you can definitely measure. I think that's the challenge of evaluation, is that you can have those bigger ideas, maybe at the theory of change kind of narrative, but you need to be able to kind of observe or ask or see or count, that they actually kind of happened, and to be able to make some meaning and conclusions from that in the way that last slide did. So yeah, just really thinking about actually attendance at all 6 workshops might be a really good indication that things were working well. You might say at the end of it, so these sort of statements of fact, if this project is successful, we will have X% of families with children 5 to 16 years attending. If this project reaches its objectives, the quality of experience will be rated as very good at a certain level. If we have delivered in a way that really works for the people who were seeking to benefit, X% of them will say that they have improved their skills in something or other. As we'll see, it's like those are kind of more, slightly sort of more kind of binary kind of questions in terms of just kind of being able to measure it. Harder things are the extent to which perceptions of the venue were changed. So it's really thinking about that. When you have that kind of change within your outcome, you need to be thinking about what the change is from to, and whether that's changed perceptions with a particular group of people. So you need to build into your evaluation, as we'll come to, you know, what did they think at the beginning, and what did they think of afterwards, or what did they think before, and what do they think afterwards, or do you have other ways of understanding people's perceptions of a venue? So it's all, you know, it's all possible. It's just breaking it down so that you're not asking things that are people can't really answer or have no meaning once you put them together as a body of data. And increased positive engagement through social media, again, you know, increased, you know, what level of social media interaction was there before? What, you know, what was it like? Positive, negative, neutral? And have you got, has there been a kind of uptick in actual interaction, or the proportion of positive engagement? And the sort of harder ones are the proportion of trainees that went on to get full-time jobs, because that really does rely on you perhaps keeping in touch with people over a period of time, unless that's kind of part of the programme and part of a cohort of trainees that you wanted to kind of work with over a period of time. So likewise, you know, people go on to engage or buy tickets in the future, all those sorts of things. There's got to be mechanisms to be tracking those over a period of time. Great. And I think, as I was sort of pointing to there are some things that are kind of easier and harder to measure. So these kind of factual things about numbers of people or participants, the audience profile, whether you asked it demographically in a survey or whether you used your own segmentation tool. You know, what tickets did they book? How much did they pay? What group size were they in terms of kind of behaviours? We can ask very easily motivations. We can ask people to rate their experience. As I say, when you get into attitudes and perceptions and values and intentions, you might come into a more fruitful conversation that is not a kind of survey ticking, but having open boxes in your surveys, or thinking about interviews, discussion groups, all those sorts of things, because they're harder to ask on a kind of, you know, scale, yes, no, without a kind of conversation around them about what that really means. So I think you're kind of going from the easier to the harder, from the more quantitative to qualitative on these different kinds of measures. So that just leads us to this kind of idea of baseline. So is the from to, so you can ask people a whole bunch of stuff before they start a project. You know, what are their skill levels, what do they like doing, have they ever been to a theatre before, all those sorts of things. And then you can, you know, see what their experience is, depending on their level of kind of engagement with the theatre, for instance. And then you can ask people at the beginning of a kind of participatory project, and at the end maybe about your confidence to get involved in group activities at the beginning, and then see what they say about that same question at the end. So this is so that you can kind of see that change, see that movement. Benchmarks might be more kind of set points. So if you got your own organizational benchmark about how whether people from the local area engage with your organization or not, and you can see it as a proportion of particular audiences or visitors, then you can kind of change that. Or you might benchmark against, you know, a more kind of regional or national statistic to see whether you're doing better or worse or whatever. So it's always useful to have those in the back of your head, especially when you're thinking about change in terms of the from what to. Okie dokie. I'm just going to pause there. I think it's time for, I'm just going to take a little 5-minute comfort break. So we'll come back at 2:27 and returning to the question, so the recording has now started again. Returning to this question of what change do you want to make? I suppose it's really useful to distinguish between evaluation and monitoring. So monitoring is generally, something that we do, on a day-to-day basis, on an ongoing basis. So that provides the information that you might, some of it you might use for evaluation, but is really saying this is an ongoing kind of view. So you'd be used to that maybe with some funders where you're looking at the amount of income, the numbers of people engaged, their kind of profiles, and a little bit about their kind of the activities and their experience and those sorts of things. So you might be tracking profiles over time, you might be tracking sales flows over time, and you can use, you might put that in the context of what we might call benchmarks from the last slide, so that you can say internally that, over the last 6 months things have been higher or lower, or this group is has a greater representation than it used to, and those sorts of things. So you're tracking those things over time, and obviously for that monitoring you can say, oh, we had this particular activity or this show or this exhibition or this event, and therefore that might have had an influence. So that's the kind of monitoring picture. I guess the evaluation is something that you would do when you've done something very specific that you want to see if that kind of works, I guess. And it might be a particular tour, for instance, or it might be a particular program, it might be a particular season that you decided was something that was kind of new or different, but it's quite good to sort of contain it from that point of view, so that you kind of bookend things, that you can see it as a kind of entity rather than necessarily being everything that your organization does, which if you've got monitoring going on all the time. And then the other thing that people talk about is a impact study, which might be a bigger thing that brings the evaluative data and the monitoring data and probably some other data as well into, to say what difference do we make holistically, given what we do. And that might be about what might be the economic impact of your organization. So what additional kind of money are you bringing into the area? Are you attracting visitors? Are you creating jobs? Are you training people? So it might be quite big economic things. It might be cultural, where you're kind of saying, actually, because we exist in this place, people's well-being is improved. Schools have got a really strong kind of education program that involves culture and creativity. So it might be more those kind of social things. You might obviously have your impact, environmental impact and environmental sustainability, and obviously your own kind of financial resilience as an organization. So it's useful just to think of these things in slightly different zones, the sort of ongoing monitoring and tracking, which is your kind of baseline for everything, and you can see things going up and down or changing, according to what you're doing. The evaluation of a kind of something that's kind of contained, and you can see the beginning and end and edges of it, which might be a capital build as well, and at the moment it's quite a lot of that about. And then this bigger kind of impact study, which is something that you might do on a more occasional kind of basis, where you're trying to make the case to various kind of infrastructural kind of bodies, local authorities. So I hope that's useful, and that you can see the difference in some of the things you said in terms of the change. So if you want people to have, in your community, to have more confidence, their ability to make change in their local area, what kind of a project would you do that would enable people to get some ideas, get the skills, practice doing something, you know, involve the right range of stakeholders. So what kind of a project, program, activity would that look like? And, you know, from where people think at the beginning that where like people just get on with them and they don't ask us, to actually we now know 2 things that we can do if we feel that there is something that we want to change in our area. So and there might be other projects where you're trying to find out more about the people you want to engage by doing a particular campaign or an activity or a show or whatever, and you would be evaluating that as the question. You know, we want to engage a particular group who's not engaging, so what are you going to do and how do you evaluate that? So I hope that's useful as a kind of framing of these different kind of things that people might talk about. Great. So in the last 20 minutes, I'm just going to talk about a little bit about the nitty-gritty of collecting data and just being, I think there's quite a lot of things about trust in data and trust in the evaluation, as somebody highlighted at the beginning, and it's really important that people feel that whatever you find out at whatever depth, that is something that they can kind of hang their hat by, and that it feels meaningful and that it reflects the people who are involved following those evaluation principles. So often you might kind of have a conversation with people and they want to ask all sorts of different questions about something which go beyond actually what you were trying to do. It's just that it's an opportunity to, I don't know, put a survey together or something like that. So making sure that you're measuring what you want to and what you need to is really important. So measuring what it is we want data to measure. So making sure it's really connected. So if you're going to do this and people are doing this, you know, are you asking the right questions as well? Reliable. So is it, you know, a good sample size? So is it representative of all the people that were involved in what you did? Is it asking the right questions again? Does it feel that you were able to get the responses from the people that you wanted to get the responses from? And did people have an opportunity to tell you all the good and the bad, the interesting and the learning? And physically, logistically, can you get to that data? Are there opportunities that for people to be able to respond to a survey, to give you their data, to be asked the questions, and are you making that as accessible as you possibly can, whether that's to do with language, whether that's to do with doing it face-to-face, whether that's to do with supporting people with British Sign Language or other languages? Is it being delivered at the moment where people have had an experience so they can now talk about it? As I say, are you looking for things to be immediate, or do you want a kind of reflection where people have had a chance to go home, and do you have their contact details so that you can get in touch with them later? So just thinking through some of those kind of logistics about where and how you can collect the data, how much, and what is it that you really, really do need. Because evaluation takes up resource, whether that's time and or money. So you need to make sure that you're getting to the information that you want, and that's going to be purposeful. There are obviously lots of different ways that you can collect data, and obviously thinking about accessibility to being involved in the evaluation. What's the invitation? Have you made an environment where people are happy to talk? Sometimes big groups are not people's comfort zones at all. Sometimes writing is not something that people like to do. So how are you going to make sure that the way that you're going to collect data ensures that you can involve as many people as you need to be involved? And the actual method will depend on what kind of data you're looking for. What story do you want to tell? Are you looking for this kind of balance of numbers, of opinions, words, pictures, video, creative responses to what you've done? what's going to encapsulate the project, reflect its true kind of essence, and how and what do you need for others to be able to kind of communicate or translate that for them. What's your resource? Always a big kind of question. And I would always say that if you don't have a lot of resource, then just keep it really simple, which may well be a very short questionnaire. If you don't have a lot of resource, don't make it so that you know you're going to get the kind of data that you can do something with, rather than thinking too broadly about creativity in evaluation, which can come in all sorts of forms. The important thing is it's engaging, and actually somebody asking people questions is very engaging, even if they then write it down on the form. In other places, you might need to do something where people can kind of do something more physical, because that's the easiest way that they can express what they're thinking. Yeah, and think about the circumstances. And as I say, bring it back to those evaluation principles. So this might mean that you collect data in broadly two ways, and whether you've got kind of creative techniques within this or not, is quantitative, so numbers. The thing about quantitative is it's quick to kind of fill out, but most of all, it's kind of standardized so that you can kind of say this proportion of people said it was good and very good. This proportion of people said yes to this and no to that. So you can, you know, everyone's responding to the same thing, and it's easy, you know, you don't have to do lots of interpretation around it necessarily. And you can see the differences between different kinds of people. So if people under 50 said this and people over 50 said that, you can see that very clearly. You always put in, you know, don't know or not applicable. And if you can put little open boxes, then it gives people a chance to kind of explain or say a bit extra. And it's easily presented, and we can make sure that it is, you know, quantitative tends to be representative of a larger group of people, and there are various calculators in terms of sample sizes that you can use depending on your whole kind of population that you want to study. When you're doing things in a participative way, ideally you would get everybody to fill out your questionnaire, because there's only 20 in a room. But obviously when you've got a room of, you know, 200, 300, 400, 500, that's not going to be possible. And there are obviously ways of indicating how robust things are with margins of error and statistical significance. So you can use all that with quantitative. But there is always a want to kind of illustrate that, or to go a bit deeper into some of those questions, or to have techniques that mean that you can involve people who perhaps, you know, it wasn't appropriate to give a survey to, where there are people who there are kind of sensitivities around who they are, or they, you know, they're not going to tell you those sorts of things. So qualitative is always a really good way of either having open questions in your surveys, or inviting people for interviews, where you want them to kind of tell you their experience and their story. Discussion groups are always a kind of, you know, comparative, you know, people kind of respond to each other in those groups. So that's often a really lovely way of kind of getting people to sort of think in a different way and develop their ideas. But as I say, not everybody's comfortable with group conversations. So just thinking of that. And obviously in any of these things, because you're not directing people to boxes or whatever, there might be unexpected things come out of it. And it's always brilliant in any of these, even if it's a quantitative survey or qualitative, having that conversation with people that you wanted to kind of benefit. But obviously qualitative takes a bit more resource and requires a bit more kind of analysis. And there's some techniques in a minute about, you know, the different ways that you can kind of bring that analysis to qualitative work. But it's good to get as much advice as possible about making sure that you've got open questions, and that you're not leading people, that you're getting involving everybody in that conversation, and that you're asking, you're probing in an appropriate way. So there's lots of techniques where you kind of get people to kind of loosen up and think a bit broadly, and then funnel in and ask them about the specific things that they experienced. So you can, there are different aspects of your evaluation that might require different parts of the data collection spectrum. So there might be existing secondary data that you use as your benchmarks, or other data that you have within your organization. If you're thinking geographically, obviously you want, something about where people live. Full postcodes you can do lots with, but you might say, do you live in this ward, or, do you live locally, further away, or you might have kind of, do you live within 5 minutes walk, half an hour walk? So some way of being able to find out where people are. Obviously postcodes are really great because you can be quite pinpoint about those, and you can do other things with postcodes in terms of profiling, if you want to. And you can put that together if you know what your kind of catchment, where 75% of your visitors come from. You can see whether people are within or outside that area. And obviously very important when you're looking at local audiences. As I say, the documentation is super important, and that can come through counting things, audience estimates, ticketing, merchandise, money, kind of area of activity. Really, really important. You might want to profile things. You might have your own segmentation that you can use to kind of profile people. You might use postcodes, you might use other kind of segmentations, audience spectrum, mosaic. So you might be able to do that with postcodes, or you might have to ask people a set of questions within your survey so that you can kind of allocate them to different groups. Again, if you're monitoring that as an organization, it's really helpful whenever you do evaluation to integrate that into your evaluations. Kind of behavioral, attitudinal behavioral is did they turn up, and what was their group size, when did they come for the whole thing? Lots of ticketing data and bookings information there. You might do some observational work where you're seeing how the patterns of how people engage with things, how engaged they are in terms of responding, contributing, looking attentive, those sorts of things. If you have a frame for doing that, there are things around kind of participant observation, where you're kind of striking up conversations as somebody who's also having the experience. And you can put those things into surveys, and these kind of more qualitative, open discussion kind of areas. And then those kind of outcomes, benefits, impacts, you can put in surveys or qualitative work. So think which tools are going to work for you best. So yeah, focus groups. You must always remember things around incentives, when people are giving up their time to be involved in evaluation. So we know that you can kind of have prize draws on your surveys, but you might have to give cash money, something that's independent of you as an organization, so that they don't feel that they have to say positive things about you. So whether that's cash or a high street voucher or whatever that might look like. And obviously qualitative work is not just a kind of random kind of chat. You do want to kind of structure that and put what we call a kind of topic guide together, so that you're kind of putting people at their ease, you're asking about some more generalized things, and then you're kind of focusing in on what it is that you want to specifically talk to them about. And you might have other stimuli for them, so that they can kind of respond to things and kind of say, do you remember seeing this? What did you think of the publicity material? When you left, did you see this? So that you can kind of remind people of their experience. And this is where there are some harder things like this perception kind of or confidence that are a bit harder to evaluate. So you might think of different kind of techniques. So one is kind of diaries as well as discussions. So if people are willing to do that, and you just have to look at those very objectively, using their words to think, you know, actually, you know, in the context of your overall framework, you know, were they positive, negative, what else did they have to say about things so that you interpret it. You might do this kind of bookending, so where you're saying at the beginning, a kind of baseline of I felt this confident about doing these kinds of things, at the end I felt much more confident, or where do they go on that? And there are various structures and frameworks where you could talk about mental well-being through the period of a project, where you ask them at the beginning, at the end. So there's lots of tools that you can use. You might, in the conversation, you know, if you're doing qualitative work, just ask people to do a bit of a scale thing, and then you can kind of have a conversation about that. So something concrete that they can start talking about, and then you can kind of go, well, you know, if you marked yourself 7 out of 10 on that, you know, why did you not, what stopped you from doing 8 or 9? Or, you know, you looked a bit, you sort of said 5, 6, what would make you go to 6 rather than 7? And then you can, you know, as we say, that kind of funnel gets to some very specific. So I think when they're harder to pin down kind of outcomes, it's good to kind of have some tools to sort of open up that conversation and enable people to talk about it, but give you some kind of specifics. So even from a qualitative group, if you've got kind of 20 people, you can say, you know, 10 out of the 20 people said that their confidence increased between 6 and 9 on a scale. So you can use bits of that from qualitative work. And then there are kind of more fun, creative things, which I think are great, for you to kind of be able to use. It's always good to have kind of artifacts or objects from evaluation, although I think you have to make them incredibly simple. The kind of tags on trees, this thing says, oh dear, I don't know why it keeps moving backwards. I went to MoMA because, so you can have a read of these. I don't know why she keeps changing the page. I entered, I looked around and I felt like I opened up in the little box. So there's some great things you can get from those. I think it's useful to think about digital when you've got digital engagement, but there's some kind of health kind of factors about it. And it just depends what element of digital is part of what you want to evaluate. So analytics tools can get you so far, but you know, you need to be able to set up your analytics so that it's getting quite specific to whatever content you've got that you're trying to direct people to. Otherwise you'll get kind of general analytics, which might show a kind of increase during a particular kind of project. But you need to be careful, you know, that there wasn't another factor in that period. And it can tell you about what people did, but doesn't tell, it's not so good about the analytics, whether they're web or social media, for instance. They tell you minimal information about who they are or why they were there, or how they rated the experience. So it might be that you have to use some of those other methods, a range of other methods, to understand about that digital experience. So it might be opportunities to have pop-ups where you're asking people questions, or inviting people to who digitally engaged to respond to a survey, or putting, you know, something about the digital experience into an overall survey. So this is a voyage of discovery around how to really get to the bottom of people's digital experience. But obviously there are these tools, every platform has its own insights, but thinking about the kind of data that they produce and how that sits with your other data, if you've actually done kind of in-person data, if it was a project that had a bit of in-person and digital activity, and just really thinking about what it is that you need to know, because they'll do size and all those sorts of reach. I think sometimes the reach is more than the population of the UK, so it's just what kind of numbers are going to make sense, and actually looking at those ones where people spent time on a website, for instance, or they they were unique users or they were on particular pages. So really putting analytics to work, especially if you've got a particular bit in your site that you're hoping that they will have used. Great. So after you've done all that, it usually ends up with quite a lot of kind of tables. So if you started with a logic model, for instance, you've got all those kind of bits, and then you're just kind of breaking it out so that you can kind of say, this is what we were doing. We wanted this many people. We want to know whether they felt good about this project, positive towards this project. And then you're saying, actually, in the indicators, very specifically, 90% came from within a period of in a geographic area, 60% were under 21. Afterwards, the number of signups on our Facebook group for this particular activity went up. So there you're looking at the facts. So if it was successful, what will you be able to say about the project? And that really helps you with some of those questions that you might put into surveys. And then you're finishing off this version of a table, but you might put in the columns that you want exactly where and how you're going to collect that data and who from, so that you've got a really good tight plan and what your timescales around those will be, and how you're resourcing it as well. Who's going to be there? Who's going to hand out the surveys? Who's going to be there on an iPad? Who's organising the recruitment to a focus group? Because that's quite a challenge. Great. Now I'm just going to check on any other questions. Yes, just to say again that the recording will be made available, as will these slides. So, and finally, the whole point of evaluation, as many of you pointed out at the beginning, is to help you plan, help you do, and of course to review, so that you can then start again or develop or go on to do kind of other things. So it's really important that when you have got that evaluation report, or you've brought all your data together, that you take a moment to kind of have a look at it, because frequently people go, oh, I've got this report on the shelf, on the shelf, and nobody did anything about it. And it doesn't really matter who it was for in the first instance. It's still really important to kind of reflect on it before you go into the next thing, because I think we're all brilliant at delivering things, and invariably you'll have to go straight onto the next project. So it's just putting aside any operational matters or anything, and just sort of saying, okay, how was it for us, and what have we learnt, and what would we do again, what would we do differently, even if it's a kind of half-hour conversation, but just kind of clearing the world. And then in a kind of deeper way, kind of going, well, if that didn't work, why did we design it in that way? Why did we think that that was the best way of designing it? So you're going on this double loop where you're kind of going, okay, so we did this and this is what happened, and we will perhaps do that same and that different. Actually going back to the beginning, back to that original kind of theory of change and the design process, and thinking, actually, did we make the right assumptions at the beginning? Did we talk to the right people? Were the right stakeholders involved? So that you can say, actually, yes, and that's why it worked. It's because we had that person and that person, or that organisation and that organisation, or it's because that moment in the project was really important to everybody, and that's why it worked. So that you can kind of distill these things in your own kind of practice, and make sure that those are things that you really remember in any further iteration. And finally, in the last 3 minutes, I don't think my timing's ever been this good, just really thinking about who your evaluation is for. So if it's for you as a group to have a look at, you might want a certain format. If it's for your board, you might want a certain format. If it's for a local authority, you might want another format. Drawing on the same data, some people might just love facts and figures. Other people want to see the story of an individual who went from here to here, and that kind of case study. Or it might be a very top line which sort of says, we should do more of this because of these 3 reasons. And what's the best kind of format that's really going to make sure that people take notice. If you've got an event at the end, you might want to have something audiovisual. If it's to go to a board, you know, it's less than one side of a piece of paper to go into board notes. So really thinking what that might look at the end and finding ways of kind of celebrating and summarizing what you have done in a way that feels good for you as organizations and deliverers, but also good for those people who were involved, and being able to kind of feed that back to them or anybody who was a partner, so that they feel that it was worth something, and that you have listened to them as part of the process in terms of what they thought was best or what you might do a bit differently another time.